Here's the example I use, which is if you go to a Major League Baseball game, they're throwing the ball around before the game. They're essentially playing catch. And if you go to an orchestra, they have rehearsals where they take care of this stuff. In the human endeavor inside business, very few people practice. I mean, you have billions of dollars on the line that these salespeople and managers are responsible for. What practice are you giving them? And I'm not talking about like a 3-day, retreat and that's it. That's like going to the gym once and being like, I'm good for the year. I just worked out. It's like, so when you hone and practice your skills of listening, storytelling, communicating, things like status, things like space, you start to develop a superpower.
Hello and welcome to Year of the Pivot on the Beyond Networking podcast. This season, we're learning from individuals and organizations who made monumental shifts in 2020 in order to keep their business alive and continue their mission. I'm your host, Brian Miller, an author, speaker, and consultant on human connection. Today's featured pivoter is Kelly Leonard. Kelly spent most of the 90s and 2000s as an executive producer at the world-famous Second City Theater in Chicago. He is personally responsible for hiring Tina Fey, Stephen Colbert, Amy Poehler, and Steve Carell. He also wrote Yes and, a book on creativity and collaboration in the workplace based on lessons from improv comedy and Second City in particular. In this conversation, Kelly takes us through Second City's pivot into virtual improv performances during the 2020 pandemic. We learned about the difference between improv and spontaneity, how to gain agency over our emotions, a brilliant exercise from his wife that you can do to achieve clarity and mental calmness in difficult times, why he describes COVID as a period of sway, and of course, he teaches us the yes and principle. This was a blast and an absolutely perfect way to close out a wild year of pivot stories. Check the show notes for all the ways to connect with Kelly. Head to yearofthepivot.com for the Pivot Power newsletter, get notified when a new episode drops, the Pivot Pearl of the Week, and gain access to exclusive live streams, masterminds, and clubhouse get-togethers. And now I bring you Kelly Leonard. This episode was made possible by Riverside.fm. Capture full, high-quality, raw audio and up to 4K video natively and without any internet interruptions. That's right, even if the internet blips out during the live call, your recording remains pristine. Head to Riverside.fm for your free trial and a big thank you for sponsoring Year of the Pivot. All right, Kelly, thank you so much for finding the time to do this. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, man. Listen, let's just start with, what are you working on right now? Like, what's on your plate this weekend?
Oh, that's interesting. I have a number of things on my plate. For the first time in my entire career, and I started at Second City in 1988 to give you an idea of how old I am, and I produced the theater from 1992 to 2015, and then moved into sort of the insights and learning part of the business. I never got executive coaching. The entire leadership team at Second City, which is much diminished because of COVID, but we're moving forward and we're for sale, and there's lots of different things going on. But I have been getting coaching, and I have been blown away by how helpful it is. And it's not a pretty exercise all the time. It's not great to hear the negative feedback. And I had both positive and negative feedback. But it dawned on me today. I said this to a colleague that it feels like in many ways I was operating in my various careers at Second City with one arm tied behind my back, and I actually succeeded probably more than I failed, which is great. But the freedom that comes with having both arms and both hands to be able to use moving forward, recognizing that in this moment where we had to pivot from a entirely live organization to an entirely digital organization, and recognizing that in the fourth quarter we were profitable with all the stages closed, with none of the touring productions happening, with none of the F&B. That's simply on the classes and the corporate work that we were delivering in the virtual spaces. We covered the bills. And as we reemerge into the live, we're bringing this along with us. And so it's very exciting to sort of feel like, wow, there is going to be both all that was good about life at Second City, and then this whole new territory that we have that allows us to speak to people who maybe would never have had the opportunity to hear or work with us.
So you covered all the questions I was about to ask. This was a great interview. Thank you for being here. No,
thanks everybody.
Seriously, that's an incredible overview, and so many things in there. Backing up to the executive coaching, that's so cool, because I have many friends and colleagues who are executive coaches, and I know that it's easy. The proliferation of online kind of Instagram coaches who mostly are terrible and have no qualifications, I think is giving coaching as a whole a bad name. But when you find the right coach, a coach who can really help you solve your own problems and get into yourself and figure out what your limiting beliefs are, like that. I know we're all kind of tired of hearing like limiting beliefs, but that's really the whole game, or at least most of it, isn't it?
Yeah, well, okay, so two things that come to mind with that. One is, when I told people I was going through executive coaching, they all assumed I was going to be coaching people. And I'm like, no. That's not what I'm talking about. But, I've had a long career. I've dealt and I host a podcast where I talk to all these different, strategic thinkers and innovators. But what's interesting is if you dig into the science of this, and there's a thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is basically the more confidence you have, the less capable you likely are. That has just been widely true in my own experiences. Mm-hmm. And I also see it for myself, is that the biggest threat to my personal spaces of innovation is my success, because I start to do it that way over again because it worked for me. And people will give you space to do the same thing over and over again because it's easier for them. We're not natural divergent thinkers. We like the patterns that we like, and it's why so many people stay sort of successful over their career, even if they're just copying the same thing they did before. And when I sort of stepped down from producing in 2015, after I wrote the book Yes And, I didn't have a plan. But what I was doing was I was upsetting my own thinking and allowed myself to sort of tap into creative resources that I didn't know were even there. And it was just like a month or two after I'd stepped down that Second City caught on fire, and everything in my office got lost, essentially, except for like 5 things. Again, creativity is rooted in these moments of upset. And it really allowed me then to, I didn't have a space I was tied to, and I didn't have a job I was tied to. What does it feel to make my way in the world with everything I've learned and everything I need to learn? And I'm sitting here now 6 years later, and I've never been happier in my job.
That's awesome. I love that note that you had about doing something over and over again. Well, it worked, so I'll just do it again. It reminds me, because I actually got my start, even though the first 10 years of my career, I was a magician. I was a comedy magician, which I know is a dangerous thing to say to comedians. They're like, oh, we don't like them. We don't like them. They're not funny.
Well, it'd be worse if
you're
a puppeteer. I think magician is both puppeteer and way above mime. So you're good.
Well, that's right. What's better than a dead mime? Nothing. So in any regard, I did get my start largely in comedy clubs. And so I was doing 30-minute sets of straight stand-up. I wanted to prove to myself I could actually do stand-up on its own if I was going to be in comedy clubs. But I did Comedy Magic, and I remember the first time I ever did a straight stand-up set, first time open mic, 6 minutes. First, everybody should do it once to understand what fear really feels like, right? To really understand what it's like to have nothing but you and a microphone in a room full of strangers who are kind of hoping you'll fail. Fascinating experience. But I remember killing the first time, which apparently I learned later is not uncommon, right? Because the nerves, there's something about the authenticity of it that really speaks to an audience. They get it. And then totally bombing the next 12 sets.
Yep.
And again, not an uncommon experience, right? Because a young comic thinks, oh, I'm just going to try to recreate what happened that first time. And it's like, it's because you were operating without a net the first time that it worked. And when you try to recreate it, something just doesn't click, right?
Well, it's an interesting difference between improvisation and stand-up comedy that even is highlights your point even more of how it relates to creativity and innovation, which is in improvisation, you have a group on stage that you're working with, right, and you are perspective taking from the audience. You are getting suggestions from the audience. You are then improvising and taking the rhythms of what they're laughing at or not laughing at and having that affect your performance. My wife, who's a comedy professor, she runs the first ever BA in comedy writing and performance in the country at Columbia College.
Awesome.
She talks about stand-ups need to do perspective giving. What they're learning is how to show the audience who they are to then be allowed to be entertained by them, which is why if you look at early stand-up sets by like Patton Oswalt or Amy Schumer or whatever, they're very self-deprecating. They're very much about like, here's all the things that I'm terrible at. And then that becomes increasingly hard when you become super successful, which is why a lot of comedians don't age well with their material. I will say, and I didn't love Seinfeld's last special, but I loved one line he had in it, because at one point he says to the audience, he goes, "Come on, you and I both know I don't need to be here." And it was a great tell on him, and it was like, oh, yeah, great, okay, we have this mutual understanding, and that it actually allowed me to sit through a mostly not very good stand-up special, but it was one great joke.
Improv is something that I have. Well, it's interesting. I have obviously. When you say improv, let's maybe start there. When you say improv, you mean something different than maybe the colloquial, hate that word, way. Why would I choose it? Way of saying of the way that people talk about it, right? A lot of people think improv like, oh, kind of just like
spontaneity,
seat in your pants, spontaneity, off the cuff. So as a magician, now as a speaker, I have lots of improv with my audience that respond in real time, but that's not what you mean by the real art of improv, right?
Right. No. It's a skill to be mastered, and that's the context in which I work. I mean, essentially, improvisation is groups of people making something out of nothing, which is something that we all do every day. And when we speak of improvisation in the sense of what Second City teaches, and we do this not just for people who want to be, great famous comedians. We do it for just hundreds of thousands of business people every year, maybe even millions. And the reason that people hire us into these spaces is because they recognize that, here's the example I use, which is if you go to a Major League Baseball game, they're throwing the ball around before the game. They're essentially playing catch. And if you go to an orchestra, they have rehearsals where they take care of this stuff. In the human endeavor inside business, very few people practice. I mean, you have billions of dollars on the line that these salespeople and managers are responsible for. What practice are you giving them? And I'm not talking about like a 3-day, retreat and that's it. That's like going to the gym once and being like, I'm good for the year. I just worked out. It's like, so when you hone and practice your skills of listening, storytelling, communicating, things like status, things like space, you start to develop a superpower. And again, I often use the quote that, if it can't be used for evil, it's not a superpower. Improvisation can be used for evil. It's what con men, are so good at. You often talk about con men, their ability to they're such good listeners. Like, yes, because they're trying to figure out how to swindle you.
It stands for confidence, man.
Yeah,
they earn your confidence.
Yeah. So, but on the good side of it, you can use it to thoroughly engage with other human beings and open up and find your vulnerable self. But it's a sculpted thing. I mean, you're asking what I'm working on right now. I had this exchange with my friend Allison Holzer, who came on my podcast. She's a social scientist and an author. And we hit it off, and we stayed in contact. And this week's podcast is with two academics who talk about the superpower of humor in business. And it's all data rich. They're Stanford professors. And she pointed me to an HBR article that said, joke telling for men in their presentations, very effective. For women, not. And then
I saw that.
You see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, of course that's true, because misogyny, of course.
Right.
But what I was talking to my wife about, she's like, yeah, but they're talking about jokes. And joke telling is a very male-dominated kind of thing. And most female comedians don't just rest on jokes. There's kind of behavior and storytelling and all these other things. So the idea that Alice and I went back forth with is, yeah, I get it. I understand this study. However, humor is more than jokes. And if you look at, certainly, my first hires at Second City into the touring company were Tina Fey and Amy Poehler. I mean, these are women who cultivated and crafted, their ability to be funny in just way better than any men who were around them, and continue to. So I think that there's like everything, there's nuance to these conversations, and we happen to be living in a time where nuance is not something that people seem tremendously interested in.
Yeah, I'm so curious though, because you talked about, working with business people, and I think and I could see a real sense of pride as you were talking about that pride, and also like just how cool is it to be able to take this art form that is entertainment based, and I don't want to say just entertainment, but that can be used just for entertainment, but then take it to help people enrich their lives far greater. That to me, that the second career I'm having as a speaker is I got to take what I learned for 10 years on stages as an entertainer, and now use what I learned, the rise and fall of emotion and tension and storytelling and all these cool things, timing, to actually take somebody to a place where their lives get better. They don't just lose themselves for an hour, which in and of itself is valuable, but I can get that from a movie too. I can get that from scrolling on Instagram if I really want to, if there's a good cat video that day, right? To be able to take something even further. So my question related then to kind of the whole reason that you and I are connected here, the year of the pivot, as it were, is what are you seeing? I'm sure this is something you were working with these people on a lot last year, the skills of being able to improvise in a tactical way, not just in an off-the-cuff way. How did you see that helping people in business keep their business alive, continue their mission, make their big pivots, and survive?
So the year before the pandemic, we do a lot of work in academia, and I've got a program that I co-lead that started at the University of Chicago called the Second Science Project that looks at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation. And I was working with Yale Executive Ed on cultivating a program around improv with leadership, and we were sort of designing it, and then everything got shut down. And the woman who was running Exec Ed actually left and joined a major soft drink company. And so we had and I had about a month, maybe 6 weeks before we got shut down, I had initiated a conversation with the people at Zoom. I was not prescient. I was not like aware this pandemic was coming. I just was like, let's explore the space. There might be something there. So we were able to pivot quite quickly. And my friend, who is now at the soft drink company, she's like, look, we have this dispersed workforce. Do you have anything on resilience? And I'm like, yeah, that's it. But we'd never delivered anything. So the small group of us got together basically twice a week, and we just started trying stuff out on Zoom. And pretty quickly we realized that while it's not the same, we can take people through this work and the new norms, and that's a big one, because a lot of times what we're doing in our live work is sort of saying, you got to think about this stuff sort of differently, and we're going to give you exercises where by doing them, you're going to feel the difference and understand that. So how do you do that in these online environments? And there's a exercise we got where it's called Count to 10. And we're in a room and we say to everyone, okay, this group is going to count to 10. And the deal is anyone can say the next number, but if two people say the number at the same time, we go back to the beginning. So it can be a very frustrating exercise when, you maybe get to 7 and then 2 people say it or whatever. And we realized, oh, this is actually perfect for like the virtual environments, because people do have a hard time talking over each other, and they have a hard time sort of recognizing maybe there's some tricks you can use, like putting up your finger if you want to speak or something like that can help set these new norms in these new environments. So that was one of these exercises that like at first didn't feel like it was going to work in an online environment, but we did it in this resiliency workshop. And then that led to a colleague of hers saying, hey, I heard that you had this great experience. Oh, I should say the other thing that we did was, because Second City is an entertainment company as well as an education company, we also recognized in these spaces that they need to come to life in different ways, because we're kind of producing a television show. So we added a musical director to every workshop. So when you enter our workshop, there is a playlist being played, a pandemic playlist, and then things are being covered on piano or other ways, so that you're having, and it was interesting, my friend at the soft drink company was like, oh, by the way, we now have music hooked up for the beginning of all of our meetings, so when you're entering to the space, it's not cold. And that's just the stuff that you wouldn't know until you sort of get in there and you allow yourself to, do some bricolage and just piece the things together that you thought you knew worked, and maybe new things, and you try those. Some of them work, some of them don't. You improvise.
Yeah. So what are the core aspects then have you seen of improvisation that these people, have you heard stories then of the folks who've done your workshop, they go back and they go, this aspect of learning improvisational skills helped me in this situation with this new virtual world, or it helped me keep this client or reach our customers right? What have you heard?
Okay, so a lot. First, there's a sense of liberation of like, oh, I don't have to just be like, see this as a doom scroll that I'm dealing with, 24/7. One of my favorite exercises, and I've had a number of people actually teach this to other people because it's really simple. My wife gave it to me, and it was for this resilience workshop. I asked her if she had anything that she was working on. She goes, "Oh yeah, I do." And it's called Wish. And you get someone to get a piece of paper, make 3 columns. In the first column, you write down something you wish you could do right now that you can't. So mine was like swimming in the salt water. And the second column, you write down the emotion you think you'd have if you were able to do that. And I wrote down refreshed. And then the third column, you write down, well, what is something you can do right now to experience that emotion? And I'm like, put water on my face, go for a walk, work out. The list actually was pretty long. And I'm like, oh, wait a sec. We have agency over our emotions. And even when things are terrible, even when things are dire, we still have control over our emotions. So giving someone that sense of sort of liberation is just opens them up to the potentiality of any moment that they're existing in.
I love that. And I may also need to borrow / steal that for the
give credit to Ann
college
Libra.
students. I work with what is it?
Just give credit to Ann Libra, my wife.
I will. No, seriously though. I mean, I work with a lot of college students, grad students, and they're really struggling in the virtual space with all the normal stresses of college these days, on top of how do we do this virtually? I feel like I'm not getting my money's worth. Is there going to be any industry to go into when I graduate? It's crazy amount of stress. And that strikes me as an exercise that's so simple that any college student, young person could do that would be so beneficial.
I think these are the things that I've been doing a big thing lately. My therapist and I were talking about this, where I'm just writing more stuff down. I'm writing more things down as a way to sort of like piece them through my brain. My friend Heidi Brooks at Yale, who I was developing the course with, she has an exercise she does with her students on the first day of class whenever there's a new group getting together. And she has everyone take a piece of paper and write down some hurt that they're experiencing right now. Then don't sign your name, just fold the paper and bring them up. And then she just reads every single piece of paper. And the bonding element that comes within that group when they recognize that everyone's got some stuff. Everyone's just got and bad stuff. We all have really, really bad stuff we're dealing with. Yeah. Just knowing that creates a kind of human connection that is, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get too big here, but I do believe those are the spaces where this divided country can find some healing when we just acknowledge the other person's pain. That is a great place for us to start. And it doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect, and it doesn't mean that my pain's not worse than your pain or whatever. There's big issues discussed. But that simple act of real humanity, I think, gives us an opportunity for working together, because we don't do this alone. There's no way we better this stuff by ourselves or in fighting clans.
Yeah. That's why I love that word that was invented a few years ago, Sonder, Sonder. It describes that feeling that everybody gets when you see a stranger and you realize just for a second that they have an entire internal life of their own that you know nothing about, and that they're looking at you thinking the exact same thing, right? That we have a noise in the back of our head and everybody else has got a noise in the back of theirs. That if you just stop and think about that for a second, it feels impossible to treat people transactionally
Right.
after having that recognition. But I feel like we need to keep having that recognition on a regular basis.
Yes.
It's not enough to have it once, because then you get back into your stuff.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's the
About.
practice. These things are important. There are countries in peril, and we should practice just at the mere minimum.
That's fantastic. I'd love to get a little bit more about your or Second City, or if you want, combine those two, your actual pivot last year. So March 12th to 14th. For me, those are the 48 hours I'll never forget as long as I live.
I was supposed to be going to. I was supposed to go to South by Southwest. A bunch of us were, and we're like, got canceled.
Yeah,
it was a Friday, and then by the Monday we were told we were shut down. So, in addition to our pivot in the corporate division in terms of just getting online and starting to create, and then talking to clients and all that stuff, and basically saying to people, we can shift this to virtual, and some people are like, well, maybe, or we'll hold off, but we had very few cancellations, which was great. And I think people just, again, being improvisers, they trust us a little bit to figure it out. The theater shut down. There was nothing we could do there. The training center started jumping on. They first tried Google. That didn't work. Then they were on Zoom, and then I think they were on Canvas or something. So it was also finding the sort of technical solution to continue classes. And we kept about 80% of our enrollment across the three cities.
Congratulations. That's huge.
So it was moving that stuff forward. And then it was sort of like, well, let's figure out some virtual shows. And so we started experimenting. And, one of the most powerful experiences I had, which is I'm watching 5 of my colleagues, performers, do this show online, and then I'm looking at I think we had around 1,200 audience members, much bigger than our theater in Chicago, and they came from all over the world. So people from Russia and China and Australia and Canada and the U.S. are all mingling in the chat, and it's like, oh, this is like, so you started to discover new things. Like we discovered that the ideal live cast for Second City is 6 people. The ideal cast for a Zoom environment is 4. That's what we discovered, the tolerance for the human eye and the interaction, both doing and watching. The music became integral. Oh, the length of a scene at Second City can be anywhere from 30 seconds to 7 to 8 minutes. We do not now go over 3 minutes on anything before you shift into some other thing, and then utilizing chat too.
Yeah. Is that the lower attention span? We kind of all intuitively understand that we have lower attention spans when we're watching a screen. Is it because we're fatigued with being on screens all day, or is it because the screen has also everything else in the known universe on it in the same place that's so easy to just jump over? If a scene, if you thought it was funny for the first few minutes, and then you're like, okay, now it's just we're tagging a little bit, it's starting to wane just a little bit. If it's just so much easier to go, I'll check Instagram for a few minutes. Is that it?
I'd be lying to you if I said I had any data on this whatsoever.
Just felt that was what was right.
And it was sort of a thing that the audience agreed with us on, as we saw over time in terms of like the things that were perceived of as successful. We had a New Year's party at Second City for the people who are still there, and we had a mentalist on, and the mentalist did this trick. Like every time he did we're on mute, but every time he finished his trick, he went unmute. So you could actually hear all of us go, what just happened, or whatever. And I was like, oh, that I hadn't thought about that. And so, it's also taking from different places and going, oh, great, we could unmute everyone to get the laugh that we don't get in these environments that we were just getting when someone was writing LOL in the chat. So you also just pick up stuff as you go along.
Yeah, there is something. Even a year later, having done 70 or 80 virtual events, both as a magician and a speaker, there is something admittedly still bizarre when you finish like a magic trick and your response is wow typed out in the chat, or like cool, or what, how'd he do that? And you're just like watching it come in, and you're like, I'm doing magic to myself on a webcam. But you know what? But at the very beginning of this, people were sure that nobody would enjoy a virtual magic show. I had talked to so many people like, nobody's going to enjoy this. And a year later, same people are saying nobody's going to enjoy this. I'm like, they've been enjoying it for a year. It's amazing.
There's so much art that has come out in this period that I think when we look back on it, we're going to be like, wow, people really innovated in this period to create spaces where we can commune, and I've been part of, I do a lot of talks and keynotes and that sort of thing, but I've been on different kinds of panels, and some of these things are just unbelievable, and I never would have done it. Wouldn't want to spend the money on airfare and hotel and all those sorts of things. And issues of equity, right? So, if you were in a position where you couldn't leave your home, or you lived too far away or whatever, you wouldn't have access to a Second City class, where actually now anyone who's got the internet can do it. And that's tremendous.
I have just a few quick questions, three quick questions to be specific, that I ask everybody who comes on this project so that we can figure out where everybody fits within the context of all these different stories. The first one, I've been told, is the hardest one from having done this dozens of times. I don't suspect you'll have too much trouble with it.
Okay.
But feel free to take a second to think, and I will cut out any super long or awkward pauses, unless it's particularly funny how long you take, in which case I will most definitely leave it in there.
All right, great.
How would you describe your 2020 in one word?
Sway.
What did you say?
Sway.
Sway?
Mm-hmm.
Like this? Like swaying
all
like
the
back
different
and
ways.
forth?
I just got introduced to two things. Kara Swisher has a new podcast that she's doing for the New York Times, and it's called Sway. And the song that introduces it talks about, when you walk in the room, do you have sway? I was also just introduced to the term work-life sway, as opposed to work-life balance. And so for me, what I'm picking up by all those uses is learning to pivot, learning to twist, but also it's okay if it's false confidence. It's like it's there's a lot of science around fake it till you make it. And in this period, when I think about what this has sort of meant to me, it was the sway of like, no, I can do this, even though I'm I am not technically minded human being. It is very funny to my colleagues that I was in the one division that was able to like move this sort of successfully through media and things like that. So when you gave it to me, I was like, innovation, that seems like everyone says that word. And then I was like, no, there's something that's the personal meets the professional. And that's why I thought of sway.
That's awesome. I learned a new thing. I had not heard that term being used in that way. And I love that, because before we hit record, you and I were chatting a little bit about our mutual friend, acquaintance, hero kind of guy, Seth Godin. And when he came on my podcast, and I know he's been on yours a couple of years ago, I asked him about balance. It was a year when I was struggling most with balance in my life. And I asked him, how do you, because he's done it all, right? The family, the work, it's unbelievable. And I said, how do you do it? How do you achieve balance, life, work, art? And he said, balance is a tricky word because there's no such thing. There's just time. He said, there's just where you are and what you do.
Yeah.
Right? And so it was such a perfect way of conceiving it, that your work life, your home life, they're not two different lives. This is your life. You do both of those things in your life. So I love sway. I love that. It's really good. What characteristics or personality traits of yours would you say, this may be an obvious one, would you say were most crucial or critical to your survival this year? Year?
I mean, the agility.
You can say improv.
it's improv. I mean, I've long, this has been my life's work, has been leading to a place where I am a evangelist for your living your improvised self. Which means that through practice and skills building and listening and integration, crucially, and knowing that you know nothing, and that's a gift. The gift of being able to walk in the room and not assume you're the smartest one, or that you can't learn from someone else. Before I got this coaching, I was asked to do a quasi TED Talk for this healthcare initiative. And along with it came a person who was going to coach you through stuff. And I've done like 4 TEDx's, and I speak at major conferences, and I got a little in my head like, what do I need this person for? But I have this sort of truth teller friend, Jenna, at Second City, who I will go to keep me in check. And I went and I sort of told her about the situation. She's looked at me like, oh, because you have nothing to learn from anyone else, you're that like, and I'm like, thank you. And so I took the coaching. It made that my talk way better, and I'm now lifelong friends with this human being. Like, we just hit it off. So it's that sort of, you got to be humble. There's a great phrase that Dan Pink said to me, but it comes from Carl Weick out of the University of Michigan, and it's fight like you're right, listen like you're wrong.
That's so good. Dan Pink said that?
Yeah, it's Carl Weick, who's a professor at the University of Michigan.
Yeah,
Pink said it to me.
Yeah. Dan seems like, I've never met him. He's actually one of the guests I've always wanted to get. Not that I've ever invited him or tried to, but he's like in my head. Like, I love his work. I have many of his books, if not all of them.
He's a big Second City fan, and he's been on the show. And
he's awesome. He is such a I really enjoy about his work that he has the ability to do many like keynoters and people like TED people. They're very entertaining, great stories, but not a lot of science to back it up. He manages to have both. He has the research, he has the data, he's got the stories, he's got swag on stage. He's swagger. He's great. He's great. And the last question I'm asking everybody, again, you kind of answered this because you're so thorough, but what is your outlook at this point on the future of your business on Second City?
It's going to be different. One of the things that we're talking about is outfitting at least one of our theaters so that it can be hybrid with regard to a live show that can also be beamed out into the universe. Prior to the pandemic, the theatrical unions, Actors Equity Association, basically made the conversation about whether you could broadcast like Broadway or other theater, that was an impossible conversation. Contractually, it was so complicated. And now I think everyone sort of realized that there's a world in which we just can never go back to squeezing people in like we squeezed people in before, tight comedy clubs, that sort of thing. And so what are we going to do? And it's like, well, there's other opportunities of, if we have to have a smaller house and we're a 300-seat theater in our main stage in Chicago, I could make that a 150-seat theater, but have another 1,000, 2,000 tickets on sale for anyone in the world who wants to come to Second City. So I think that I'm not worried that we'll never enjoy live things together in crowds, but I do understand that we're never going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle. And from the science I've read, there's going to be future worse pandemics, and we just now have to recognize that sometimes we got to be able to shut off the faucet and then still be able to have some water.
Right before you, do you have 2 more minutes?
I'm good.
Before?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Because it just occurred to me that you and I got into such a good, easy flow conversation so quickly, so early, that just in case there's somebody listening who is not familiar with yes and as a principle at this point, I'm sure they can kind of figure out what it means, but can you give us the 1-minute version and how it might apply to anybody listening to this who wants to be more resilient, better prepared for their next pivot, capital P?
Yeah, I mean, the reason my book, which is about how we take improvisation into business, I co-wrote it with Tom Yordan, who used to run our corporate division. It was originally called The Revolution Will Be Improvised, sort of reference to Gil Scott Heron, even older than our earlier conversation. And HarperCollins liked it until they took a workshop and we taught them the idea of yes and they're like, that is the stickiest concept, that needs to be the title. And essentially, when I mentioned groups of people are making something out of nothing, you get nowhere if you don't have a script. You get nowhere by saying no. You're not going anywhere. And you actually don't get that far by saying yes. We say you have to say yes and. You have to affirm and contribute, and that allows you to explore and heighten ideas. When you yes and, you are not judging. When you yes and, you are not blocking. When you yes and, you can go to ridiculous spaces that you never would have gotten to because someone would have stepped in and stopped the fun. And when we're leading the exercise for people to do it, we have them pair up and try building something, we say like a reunion, by saying no to each other, nothing happens, and yes actually doesn't get them far. But when they yes and, these reunions, they're having like sushi on the moon, and we're like, I'm here to tell you that the greatest scenes I ever saw developed at Second City seemed impossible and ridiculous because the yes and went to places that you just like you don't normally go, and that's the point. We shut ourselves off. We believe we don't have agency, and we just limit ourselves over and over and over again, and we just don't have to. And so yes and becomes a way to sort of say it in sort of early stage training. You will never ever see an experienced Second City performer actually say the words yes and, because then becomes a mindset. It's not about the words at all. And I want to tack one more thing on. When we started this thing at the University of Chicago where behavioral scientists and our sort of improv experts would get together every week in a lab. And we did research, we did executive education programs still going on today. One of the things that we taught them was yes and. They said, this is great, but what happens when you have just a conflict that you can't resolve, that you really can't yes and from? What's the cue there? And they went away and looked at the research, and then we looked at what that cue might be, and we came up with it, and it's thank you because. And the idea here is if we're in disagreement, like let's say you're anti-vax, and I'm not, but I need to stay inside this conversation. I need to thank you sincerely for sharing your information. And the because part is crucial. I need to find something that I am actually in agreement with you on, and it could be like, thank you, because you do not want your child to get hurt. That's why you don't want to vaccinate them. I don't want my child to get hurt. That's why I want to vaccinate them. So we actually are agreeing on the main point of this thing. So let's stay inside. And we've tested this, and there's going to be a paper coming out probably next year or late this year, which shows the tremendous success this has to keep people inside conversations that otherwise they wouldn't have stayed inside.
That's awesome. I love the thank you because that is such a great way of verbalizing and imagining that mindset of kind of tactical empathy. Because I think a lot of people get really hung up on the, like you said, but what happens? I know I'm supposed to find something and agree, but what if I really don't agree with this person? How am I ever going to connect with them?
Find the yes. And there's a yes inside there somewhere, and it's if you enter into these spaces with gratitude. It's to our earlier point of seeing each other as human. Let's take that a step further. Let's look at that we can be taught by this person, that they have something of value to give to us. I don't think I've ever met someone who wasn't capable of teaching me something that I didn't know. And that's just it's hard to maintain that 24/7, but it's a better way to live.
Yeah. Well, it can be an ideal, even if we never really achieve it, right?
There you go.
I mean, that's the whole idea. So, Kelly, I can't thank you enough for this. Such a fascinating conversation. People want to go find you, connect with you, or if not you, then your work. Where should they go?
Well, okay, so secondcity.com has all things Second City, and my podcast is there, Getting to Yes And, which is also at WGN Radio. And then I'm KL Second City on Twitter, and then you can find me on LinkedIn. And I post every week and different research and different things that we're doing. So yeah, come follow.
Amazing. Well, I will have all that in wherever this ends up, show notes, description, below, above, wherever we are on the internet. Thank you so much, and we'll stay in touch, I'm sure.
Thanks, Brian.